today we're talking about populism and why populism is neither left nor right, but anti-pluralist. And we will also talk about why, like, some autocrats that we know, like Putin or Lukashenko, are not populists, but like dictators, and what might be the differences. So I go into some clarifications about political theory. This is a very new field. It is at the moment conceptualizing. So this is what I'm telling you, a very emerging field. It's not something that is long established. So if you read whatever Hannah Arendt or Karl Popper, they don't talk much about like populism. They might have a conception about it, but what we recently do in political theory is developing a real concept of populism. And that's what I try to do. I give you a little bit of the overview of the research, and I have also worked extensively in the field. So I try to give you my best opinion on this. So how did I start to get into this issue of populism, and why do I think it is interesting? Well, for me, I lived in the UK, and as you all know, we were facing Brexit a couple of years ago, and ever since this has basically like ingrained our society. Like we are just talking about Brexit, finally it's over. But in the past, we have always thought that everything that is populism is completely an old idea. So in the way the discourse was shaped in the UK is that populist movements are always right-wing. They're always conservative movements, they're always nationalist movements. And I used to certainly believe that narrative too, because when you look at the Brexit vote, it was always a nationalistic old kind of idea. It was nothing new to study. However, I also am a native German, and I also follow the political scene in Germany quite closely. And what I saw last year was striking to me. Like if you focus your attention on the last column on the left, the 18 to 29-year-olds, you see the black poll result, so the black chart there with 22%. This is not the dominating parties in Germany, like the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats, but this is the far-right populist movement. And below it, you have the Green Party, which is normally also like a party that only polls around 5%. So the party of Angela Merkel with the youth only gets 17%, while in your normal votes, it gets like 40 to 45%, or like in very best times, but like around 40%. So it was striking to me that this whole narrative that the old are the ones that drive populism and nationalism, they are not the ones that are in many countries behind populist resurgence. In fact, there are populists that are supported heavily by the young. And as I said, even in Germany, you now see the far right gets quite significant voter traction with the young people, like 22%, the strongest party affiliation. So I take this as an incident where I wanted to study more about it. And I combine here my knowledge that I gained from, first, my academic knowledge as somebody who has studied political philosophy, doing a PhD in political economy, as well as my political involvement. I work with civil society in many, many different countries on democratic education. So I combine the two, and I will share this in this presentation with you, what my results are. First, I will conceptualize what populism is and what I think makes it a distinct ideology, not only about rhetorics, but a distinct ideology that needs to be mapped in our political theory. Like liberalism, like socialism, populism should be added to the list. The next one, I will contrast it with a different strain of certain political ideologies, namely pluralism. And here I have in mind especially liberal pluralism. And once I will explain what populism is, you will see that it is at odds with pluralism, but more on that later. And then I will basically say how populism evolved, because I don't think it's only an ideological matter why this came about, but it came by very concrete steps, or like by our political landscape and how it was shaped. So let me dive right into. And just one remark, we will have some interactive elements, don't worry about that, but you can always use the chat to intersect, because first of all, I speak very fast. I know that, and we are all not native speakers. So just intervene. Like whenever I'm like, again, talking either too fast or too complicated, although of course, I suppose you're all much smarter than me, so it cannot be too complicated. But whenever something is unclear, you can mark it in the chat. I have the chat box open, so you can just jump in right there. So let's dive into populism and what it is, because the first kind of weird thing about populism is that all these leaders that I just put out there are labeled as populists. And this is weird. Like Viktor Orban conservative right wing. Then you have Marine Le Pen. She's like right wing, but also economically very, very left wing. Then you have like Nigel Farage, who would be economically very right wing, but also populist. Like he's like economically further from Marine Le Pen than anything else. He's like a free marketeer, while Marine Le Pen is like a hardcore interventionist. Then you have like people like Trump without any ideology. Then you have like hardcore socialists like Chavez or Maduro, who are always labeled as populists. Then you have like Duterte, like hardcore law and order people. You have people of very different religions, like for example, Viktor Orban is somebody who's like advocating Christianity. Then you have Erdoğan, who tries to re-Islamize Turkey, which has, you know, the heritage of Ataturk and being a secular state. Or Modi, that you see down there, the Prime Minister of India, who invents Hindu nationalism, like blending these two ideologies together. So very different people. And again, like sometimes they might seem to be at odds with each other. Like for example, Viktor Orban always claims that George Soros and the Jews are behind everything, but a week later he meets with Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. So it's very weird what's going on with these populists. So let me check with you. What do you think is populism, like as an ideology? You now see, it's not like we can say, oh, a socialist is populist or a nationalist is populist. Like there is something more distinct about it. So I created a Menti room for us. So you would open on your smartphone or wherever you have a device where you can type that in, go to menti.com. You don't need an app, just like in a browser. And then you type in that room code, which is 5311040. And put in there what you think populism is. So 531140. I will now switch my screen, so don't worry. I will give you the code in a second again. I just have to open the right Chrome tab. Yeah. So here. No. So here you should see the question, what is populism? Again, the room code should be 5311040. And here you can type what you think with one word, with multiple words. You can type in what populism is to you, and preferably in English, since again, like my Russian is too colloquial to be tested like that. So what do you think is populism? What are features of it? What is like specific criteria? How would you describe it if somebody asks you what populism is? Let me know. Okay. For some people it's working, so I give you some more time. The best, I mean, whoever wrote anti-pluralism, they have already won because they kind of they took it from my title. Excellent work. Propaganda. Okay, I already very interesting because a lot of people immediately associate it with a specific rhetoric. Like it's not only an ideology, it's like about the rhetorics. We all know like how populist speaks. You all know the propaganda of a populist. There are some features to it, and I will explain what their features are of this propaganda. But I think it is more, there is more to it than only the propaganda. Political claim, so like political promises, I would say, yes. Engagement, anti-globalism. Yeah, very popular, especially I think with Trump. So it's kind of anti-elitism almost. Promising, so some people took that on. Realistic approach. Again, from some populists, very prominent. They say like they're very pragmatic. Anti-elitism, I see there. The people, also I think very good. Identity politics. Corruption. I mean, depending, that could be affiliation with populism, that they are corrupt, although they want to fight corruption. I would say the proto-populist, or the populist before populism was a thing. Like, again, I would say Alexander Lukashenko is a classic case. He was an anti-corruption politician in the beginning. National interests, satisfying people's demands. Noodles on ears. This is, I guess, linked to Ukraine, if I get it correctly there, the reference to Timoshenko. pretense of being with the people. I think that's great. Okay, we have a good picture already there. I leave it there. Already very good people, very good answers. I will now jump back to my presentation and pick upon certain things that you have said. So let me share again. So here are the couple of core features that I think make for the picture of populism. And many of you have already mentioned certain aspects to it. But I think we have to see the totality of the whole concept, because as you all are very well versed in political theory, you know that in political theory, we approach certain concepts by what is called conceptual analysis. That means we lay out certain conditions, necessary and sufficient conditions for what a concept is. And I give you some of the sufficient condition, necessary conditions. So here, first one, populism is moralizing. So a lot of you brought that in already, pretending to be with the people, but it goes further than this. Populism, as the word already suggests, comes with popular, right? So it puts the popular will. Some wrote it in our Menti, the general will, which comes from Rousseau. But here, the popular will, it has supreme status. So it's not like in a democracy where popular will is sometimes needed to make a decision. But here it is the moral force. Everything we do is about the popular will. Populism is the supreme reign of the popular will. And again, it's different from democracy, and I will explain later why that is. It's basically democracy on steroids, democracy without any constraints. Next, by moralizing, it's not only that populist leaders will always claim that they are with the people or represent the people, but they use also the symbols that seem to represent the people. So often they use history to represent the people. Not only I'm representing Russians right now, but I represent all of Russians, like the Russian lineage, the Russian history. And I think Putin is, for example, excellent at this because he invokes a kind of national pride. He has a whole concept of what the greatness of the Russian Empire or whatsoever is. And he inspired many other populist leaders. For example, Erdoğan, he returned to kind of the pride of the Turkish nation back to like the Ottomans, you know, like Atatürk and others, they didn't talk much about the Ottomans. Like Erdoğan tried to revive this whole history and moralized it again. Again, Viktor Orban, Austro-Hungarian Empire, there's something linked to history and symbolism that they use. The next one is they are anti-pluralist in two senses. The first one is they are anti-pluralist in a metaphysical sense. That means a populist denies that there is pluralism, meaning diversity in society. So they give the illusion that a society is homogeneous. Okay, there is no diversity. Like especially in modern Western societies, you basically arrive at a point where you say like diversity is our strength. That is like Justin Trudeau or whatever, you know. And the opposite is true for the populists. They give you the illusion that the nation, the popular will is homogeneous. There is a general will of all people, of the peoples of whatever, Russia, the people of Belarus, the people of Turkey, you know, they have a general will. And it's not that there's a diversity of will. Like in other nations, you could say, oh, these groups have these interests and this individual has this interest. Like that's modern individualism. This is exactly the opposite, denying diversity. And people like Viktor Orban go as far as really sketching what this general will is. It is the will of a specific kind of person, namely the typical Hungarian. Traditional family structures, traditional beliefs. So in his sense, Christianity, lineage to the Austro-Hungarian tradition and the greatness of Hungarians and stuff like that, you know. So they play with that. So that's the first one, metaphysical denial of diversity, so anti-pluralism. The second is they also tackle what is called liberal pluralism in its institutions. So usually in a liberal democracy, votes or like the popular vote doesn't decide everything, right? We don't vote on certain issues, namely who can marry and who cannot marry or whatever. We don't vote on the individual rights that people have. These are outside of democratic decision-making. However, the populists claim that the supreme power of the popular will is more important than institutions. In fact, institutions hold us back. Therefore, they disentangle pluralist institutions, which is another word for separation of powers. So any pluralist or any populist will dismantle pluralistic institutions. They will attack the rule of law, they will attack individual rights, they will attack the separation of powers. So instead, they want to have all institutions cater to the supreme power of the will of the people. Okay, so this is the conceptual second pillar. So how does this look more in detail? Well, in their rhetorics, they often use a very interesting device, because they are politicians and they nevertheless have to acknowledge that they are enacting the supreme will of the people, like this general popular will. And this they do by giving themselves the illusion that they are close to the people, which is very weird in some cases. Like Donald Trump, like he never like lived the ordinary life, you know, like he always like he has been born with a golden spoon, basically, you know, like he's not very ordinary. Or Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban is like Oxford educated. He's like part of the elite, you know, like how is he representing the common man? At least what you have to give to Erdoğan, Erdoğan is like kind of a common man. He was like a football player and then like a cab driver, whatsoever. So, but most of them, they just give you the illusion that they are part of the common man. And then they have a very beautiful rhetorical device to make clear that they are representing the popular will. And this is what I call the silent majority argument, which is the most hideous argument that you can ever make, because it is like fraudulent. The silent majority argument goes as follows. You basically say, the silent majority is with me. And what that means is I can never make a counterclaim to you, because if the silent majority is with me, I can never ask the silent majority, are you with me? Are you against me? Because they are by definition silent. So if you make a silent majority argument, you can, in philosophical terms, never falsify that argument. And therefore, like, it is just a rhetorical device to make up stuff, you know? And again, like, unfortunately, I make a lot of Belarus analogies these days, but again, Lukashenko always says, oh, the silent majority might be with me. Like the silent 80% are with me. And of course, if you ask the people if they are with them, a few less respond by yes, that they are with them. But again, he's talking about a silent majority you cannot ask. Wait, there are some questions in the chat. Yes, I think, Gabriela, you make also a nice point, and I will talk about that at the end of my presentation, where all of these populist leaders evolved. They come from a, I would say, a liberal mistake, but more on that later. I acknowledge that like Putin and Erdogan have a very similar like story in the way they are also perceived by the West, but more on that in a second. The next is anti-establishment. Again, keep in mind that populism is the supreme reign of the popular will. That means that democracy has to be unleashed, like the will of the people has to be unleashed. Any kind of institutions are like boundaries, and therefore populists always want to dismantle institutions because they want to give reign to the people. And since they define what the will of the people is by their silent majority arguments, they can basically do whatever they want. And they therefore overcome institutions and elites, because elites are kind of safeguards in any system, right? They keep like checks and balances. So they're very much anti-establishment, anti-certain institutions. Next, and I think this is very interesting for how populism eradicates certain political systems, it is very leader focused. So the party becomes in any of these settings less relevant. And the party is normally in any liberal democracy, the entity through which you have or gain political power. Like, you know, because a party stands for ideas, for example, liberalism, social democracy, conservatism, right? But in a populist framework, these devices of liberal democracy, namely parties and ideas, get less relevant. It's again that politics focuses on the individual. Like you see that with Trump, the Republican Party could not prevent Trump. The party itself that nominates him cannot prevent the populist self. You see it with Putin. Look at United Russia and like how relevant the party is. It's way less relevant than the person himself, right? If you look at AKP or AK Party in Turkey, the same. Erdogan is basically the party. The party is super weak. They wouldn't get all the majorities that like Erdogan is getting. And you see this pattern with all the parties and the populists. They kind of portray themselves as like the caretaker of the nation. And again, you see that with, especially in the old post-Soviet world, with a lot of leaders that are not necessarily populists, but are post-populists. Again, take Lukashenko, because he's a good case for being a post-populist, proto-populist. He's always the bad guy, like the father figure of the nation. And the same way Erdoğan portrays himself as the father of the nation, or whatever leader you want to plug in there, Viktor Orban, or, you know, I don't think it holds true for Trump, but for the rest, you get it. Erdogan goes as far as follows. I like this anecdote about him. He saw that at a party rally, there was a child with his dad there, and the dad had a pack of cigarettes in the pocket here. And Erdogan went to this family, took the cigarettes from the dad, crushed it, and threw it away, and said to the child, "If your father smokes ever again, let me know." You know, this is the ultimate caretaker attitude. I don't only take care of politics, but I also give you like moral education. And lastly, one of the most important parts, the way populist politics works is not by consensus making in a democratic space, like liberal democracies, where you come together, you win this election, then it goes more like your way, but, you know, with some constraints, and we find common solutions in the parliament. It is divide and conquer. It is us versus them. The political is a battle of your group versus the other group, and politics is defined that way. So liberals especially define politics as joint cooperation. The populists return to an old theme by the German philosopher Carl Schmitt, where they say politics is the existential battle of friend versus enemy. Carl Schmitt, obviously very influential on the Nazis, like defined politics as the battle, the existential, the meaningful battle, what gives you meaning as a citizen, of friend versus enemy. And once you understood that, you understand also the way populists do politics. Like Trump divided the country, and that's what I think with Trump, it was horrendous. Not that his policy proposals are like bad. I mean, they're like very mediocre. But what he did to the country, he kind of created a country where now people are on the streets fighting with each other. And it's like crazy to imagine that. And this is a classical case of populist party politics. It's the divide of us versus them, you versus them. So the friend-enemy distinction, I think, is crucial. And you see that as a device in all populist movements. So I think that kind of classifies all the populist movements. Again, there might be some other aspects to it, but this is, I think, the best shot of conceptualizing populism that we have. So this is, I think, if you want to make sense of populism from a political theory perspective, this is kind of the overview. Let me just quickly go into Alexander's question. Putin wasn't such in the beginning. He started with aggression against oligarchs and mass media. It depends, like maybe we can throw that in later on. I wouldn't also label Putin as a populist. Maybe it's helpful to quickly jump into the Putin question itself. A populist arises basically out of a liberal democratic setting. So they kind of dismantle the institutions that were there. For Putin, as well as for Lukashenko, this was not the case. They didn't start with liberal democracy. They dismantled a system that was already to a certain degree unideal, you know? There were not real structures in place, no real good constitution, no separation of powers in the first place that they could dismantle and roll back. So for example, there is not so much anti-pluralism. Although, again, for Lukashenko's playbook, this fits perfectly because he, with his referenda in 1995 and 1996, did basically nothing else than being an anti-pluralist in terms of institutions. Alexander, did Democrats nothing then divide the country? Just Trump? No, I don't think so. Like, I don't want to bash only on Trump. Nevertheless, this us versus them rhetoric is not like this with Obama. That's just the case. Like, people are not as polarized. I also lived in the US for quite a couple of time. I think the divisiveness of the political discourse that you have there, dividing the country in us versus them. For example, drain the swamp is a classical populist case of moving. That's something you don't see with Obama, and that's what you don't see with other populist, with other democratic leaders. You see it with some branches of the Democratic Party now too. Like I would say Bernie Sanders is more a left-wing populist, and AOC might also qualify as a left-wing populist. But again, this is populism, not about party politics. So good, let's jump ahead. So if you believe my story so far, then you understand that nothing about this is our common framework of left versus right. All the criterion are not saying, oh, you are socially conservative and economically liberal or whatsoever. It doesn't play on this traditional set of ideologies. Instead, I think it has to be understood as a shift in political ideologies in general. So if you believe that these points are true, populism attacks diversity, populism attacks a multi-party system, which is basically a part of liberal democracy, populism attacks civil society and attacks the rule of law, then you can conclude that the main feature of populism is not that they are pro-free markets or they are socially conservative, but that they are anti-pluralist in a fundamental sense. They are anti-pluralist in terms of plural institutions, so they are anti-liberal democracy, and they are anti-pluralism in terms of diversity. So two claims, metaphysical, anti-diversity, as well as anti-liberal democratic. And they admit that themselves. Viktor Orban famously coined the term, I'm not a liberal Democrat, I'm an illiberal Democrat. So basically he just gives the terminology even more meaning in giving this, what I call anti-pluralism, a specific catchy name, namely illiberal Democrat. He says he's an illiberal Democrat, and that's nothing else than another word for populism. If you now understood what I mean by populism, the supreme power of the popular will, you understand that liberal democracy is constraining the popular will. Therefore, illiberal democracy gives all reign to the popular will. And again, it's a very illiberal idea. So Orban is certainly right. And I will explain why he's right. So concluding my overview on populism, populism is neither left nor right, because you can be a left-wing populist like Bernie Sanders, or you can be a right-wing populist like Viktor Orban. Doesn't necessarily say something about our traditional senses of politics. It is fundamentally attacking a framework, namely the framework of pluralism in its metaphysical and institutional dimension. So now I said a lot about pluralism. It might be good to dive in a little bit, because I don't know how familiar you are with the terminology there. It's, I think, a very abstract concept and often not very well defined. So I try to give it a shot, based mainly on the ideas of John Rawls. So I hope that might help. We know populism mostly from politicians like this, which I call always the liberal Care Bear, like Justin Trudeau. Like if you want to have a nice sounding sound bite, you get like Justin Trudeau. Like he says stuff like, I love diversity, or like our strength is diversity, or he says like everybody should have a right to water, or whatever. He says like nice things, but once you dig deeper, he's not so substantial. You know, like I think he's just a Care Bear. So let's dive into more substantial stuff. For that, I have a little exercise for you. And basically you can do the same that we did before. You go to menti.com. This time you don't have to type stuff. You just will be exposed to a painting. So menti.com, and the room code is 5136617. So let me write that in the chat. So this is the room code. I will quickly share my screen. You should see a painting if you are there. So let me just jump. Oops. Let me just quickly jump to the right thing. Give me a second. You should see a painting, and while I'm like searching for the thing, you just might want to look at the painting. Immerse yourself in it. You should see this painting. Yes, not like in your little boxes if you see it. Yes, hopefully. Yes, good, excellent. You can also just nod. Okay, good. So immerse yourself in the painting, like for 3 or 4 seconds. Good. So, question for you, is this painting beautiful? Okay. Yeah, I think like around 25 or something. So I give it 5 more seconds and then we see. You cannot abstain, so you have to click. Okay. Wow. I like this group. This is one of my favorite paintings. Okay. Objectively, it's beautiful. It's like C. Twombly's famous Odyssey, like part of the Odyssey in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. 4 people, however, insulted my favorite painting. Like, again, it's objectively beautiful. See, my speech gave even more votes to the painting now. So 4 people, however, find this painting ugly. So they insulted not only my my feelings in terms of like how I feel about the painting, but also my aesthetic value. So let's see whether we are on better terms when it comes to morality. I'm a moral philosopher, so at one point we have to talk about the trolley problem. And the trolley problem goes as follows. A driverless trolley is heading down the tracks. On the tracks, there are 5 people that would die if the trolley goes over them. Luckily, you are next to a lever, and once you pull that lever, you can redirect the train to another part of the tracks where there's only 1 person. So 5 versus 1. If the train goes through, it kills 5. If you divert, it only kills 1. So the question for you is, would you divert the trolley? Oh, wow. Okay, we see a little bit of divergence there. 7, 8. Yeah, some people are already negotiating with me, that they want to avoid this problem altogether, but it's a philosophical thought experiment. You just have to do it. Good. We see 9 to 5. So majority of you would sacrifice the 5. Like without hesitation, they would sacrifice the 5. And then again, going against my moral intuitions, because I wrote a paper where I think it is wrong to redirect the trolley. Because I think killing is worse than letting die. Once you redirect the trolley, you're actively engaging in it. You're kind of killing. If you're not engaging in it, you're just letting die, and letting die is morally less bad than killing. So 10 of you have fundamentally different moral beliefs than me. So we seem to be on the same page aesthetically, although 4 of you insulted my favorite painting. And now 10 of you fundamentally disagree with me about morality. So last question, because my students always ask me, so I outsource this to you. And since you're all philosophically very well trained, what is the meaning of life? Just write down whatever comes to your mind. You don't have to deliberate a lot. It depends whether you will go to jail for killing that person. Well, it's a moral thing. You don't have to imagine a state, but yeah, I see where you're coming from. This group is very interesting. Like, it's not very upbeat, people. Life have no meaning. Life has no meaning. There is no meaning. Chaotic. Life is absurd. No meaning. Okay. This doesn't give much hope. Love. Okay, good. I sparked something. Beauty, friendship. We are getting better. Kindness. Memes, of course. To love. Be truthful. Oh, nice. To be free. Good. What we can see here, 42. I was just waiting. Like usually I say I finish my presentation on this slide when I see 42. It's like every time this happens. Anyways, good. What did I want to show you with these things that I just gave you? Well, I showed you the following. Although you are a rather homogeneous group, of people interested in philosophy from a certain region, maybe with similar educational background, you just disagreed with each other on the most fundamental things. You just engaged in pluralism. You disagreed about what is beautiful. You disagreed about what is moral and just. You disagreed what is the good life and what makes for a good life. The most existential questions. And that's pluralism. Pluralism recognizes that we will always disagree. We will always disagree not only about what is the best pizza topping, like trivial things, but about the most fundamental questions. There will always be disagreement about what is the meaning in life, what is the conception of the good life, what is beautiful, what is aesthetically pleasing, what is moral, what is just. And I didn't even start about religion, right? And this is the fundamental insight that pluralism wants to teach you, that there is what John Rawls calls deep disagreement, that there will always be disagreement. Because one might say, maybe we just have to teach people more stuff. Like, for example, the 4 people who said this painting is ugly, I should just give them good books on conceptual art and about C. Twombly, and then they will realize that it's beautiful. But what do we do when we disagree and I give you all the information that is possible and you still disagree? Well, I don't have any other choice than to live and arrange with you. These things, there is no ultimate settlement to it. There is, as I said, John Rawls says, deep disagreement. And this makes disagreements in such manner different from normal disagreements, because when we disagree about facts, like, for example, whenever like Vladimir I was born or whatever, we can use history books or the scientific method to determine who's right or wrong. However, if you disagree about such values that I mentioned, like aesthetics, like justice, like religion, like beauty, what can you do? Ultimately, we don't have a tool to solve this disagreement. And in liberal democracy, we therefore retract to toleration as a virtue to deal with this disagreement. Like, we deal with disagreement because we accept that there will always be deep disagreement. However, the populists don't understand it the same way. They negate that these deep disagreements exist in their societies. And it's fundamentally anti-pluralist, as I said. That's why we have to understand populism as anti-pluralism, because it denies these deep disagreements. There are no deep disagreements about Hungarian values. They're very clearly defined. And Hungarians do not disagree about these values. You see, this is the fundamental pluralism versus anti-pluralism. The pluralistic tradition that comes out of, I would say, the liberal thinkers like John Rawls or others are portrayed here with a counter movement. And as I said, the liberal value that is anchored to this, that has been then put forward by people like John Stuart Mill, Alexis de Tocqueville, and others, has always been then to deal with it in sense of toleration. Because in the normal framework of liberal democracy, we perceive individuals not as our input-output machines. Like, human beings in a liberal framework are perceived as agents of dignity and agents of agency. So they have their own agency. It's not like you put information in, everybody process it in the same way, and the same output comes out. So for example, take a thought experiment. In a liberal society, it is unimaginable that even if we would read all the same books, all the same newspapers, listen all the same TV stations and radios, we would all think the same. That's something that in a liberal framework you have to give up, because you believe in individual agency. So therefore, there is a human element to it, an individual element, and therefore, even if you have the same information available, you might come at different judgments or might arrive at different judgments. So it's not input-output model. And that ultimately means that the liberal society is always a pluralistic, open, diverse, colorful society. So that's kind of the physical roots. So whatever, like Justin Trudeau said here, I love diversity, like he basically states something very like trivial. I just try to give you the fundamental philosophical underpillars. Where does this come from in terms of philosophical thought? And it comes from these deep disagreements that people have about values, because you cannot dispute, like, when people question that you can solve questions of values, I always say, when somebody says, I care most about freedom, and the other person says, and I care most about equality, who do you decide is right? You cannot decide. Like, values cannot be compared like facts, you know. They are incommensurable. That's the English term for it. They are not comparable with each other. Like freedom is not better than equality. That's like a nonsensical statement, right? You cannot make such comparisons. So that's kind of the philosophical underpinning. Let me just quickly check the chat. Yes, David, I will check what kind of papers I can do to the trolley problem. Mine is not like available at the moment online, but I can try to find a good one that represents my view. So maybe you note in the end my email and just drop me a reminder, because I tend to such things to forget. Gabriela says, but sometimes some opinions shouldn't be heard. Someone has an opinion, but a superior race, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we can talk about how far toleration could go. I think there's a paradox of tolerance as well, Karl Popper. Maybe in the end, we can return to that too. So if you believe what I say makes some sort of sense, then you can see a kind of shift in how we do political theory in the 21st century. Because the old school way we looked at the political landscape was we looked at people who come from the right wing, and we looked at people who come from the left wing. And mostly we said left wing and right wing are divided by economic terms, right? Like if you're left wing, you are more in favor of redistribution. And when you're more right wing, you tend to be more in favor of like markets and stuff like that, all right? So this was the old paradigm. However, I don't think that makes a lot of sense now. Since a lot of you have already written in our first Menti that identity plays a much bigger role, I agree with you, and I don't think that these old terminologies of left versus right in terms of economics makes much sense to analyze the political landscapes that we see in many countries. And therefore, I think we have a realignment that is going on in politics. Steve Davies calls this the great realignment because he thinks it will be here to last. It changes the nature of our politics, how we perceive it. And he says it's not the economic dimension under which we separate one camp from the other, but we separate by how open versus how closed they are. So the populists stand for the closed society, okay? They are anti-pluralists, obviously they stand for the closed society. And the closed society can be based on some sort of nationalism, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And the open society is also a much broader term. It's people who are not only like Justin Trudeau naive about diversity, but also people who, like liberals, believe in fundamental agency and deep disagreements. So there can be a larger movement on what we would nowadays perceive as, like I would say in Germany, the Green Party, Social Democrats, the liberals, and parts of the Christian Democrats. So basically the center that are in favor of the open society, and they are under attack from what I would call the closed society advocates, which mainly are represented by the populist movement. And this is, again, a person who recognized this shift. So I was very puzzled when I saw this last year, the statement by Vladimir Putin, where he says, this modern liberalism is, in my opinion, obsolete. And what he alludes to is that the kind of framework that we have been operating on, this whole old school politics, and where like left, right, liberal, has to be overcome. The new kind of alignment is the alignment that we see between the populists and the anti-pluralists. And this is taking shape everywhere in the world. So for example, here is an attack on liberalism from the populists in the US, like National Affairs is a conservative right-wing news outlets, and Joshua Hawley, like if you want to read one person or want to have one person on the radar who is like a right-wing populist with like some intellectual fundamental stuff to say, it's Josh Hawley in the US. Like he is certainly somebody who wants to position himself as like the proto-populist or like the super populist. And they're kind of gathering everywhere in the world. This is, for example, a conference that was held in Rome, where they wanted to revive nationalism, but with real substantial arguments. And the right people gather there, right? For example, Viktor Orban, Salvini from the Lega Nord, they are all there to network amongst themselves because they have recognized that this shift is going under. Like it's not anymore that the left is versus the right, but it is the people who are advocating for the closed society, namely the populists, versus people advocating for the open society. This is like this fundamental shift under which you can now analyze the political landscapes in our societies. So let me close by saying how this politically originated. So I gave you a little bit of a political theory overview of the concept of populism. I gave you an argument why it is so relevant and how it can be best contrasted, namely by the kind of success of liberal pluralism. And now let me see how it politically evolved from like more historical perspective. I think it evolved mostly from two problems of liberalism. And here I don't understand liberalism as a party politics ideology, but from consensus of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy has been the governing ideology and the paradigm for many, many different countries. So it's not like one specific liberal party. Like think of liberal democracy as a very broad framework that I would say, for example, 90% of academic papers are published on, for example. So one problem is that liberal democracy or liberalism is a very big tent ideology. So liberals can range from people such as this, like, for example, Margaret Thatcher to Hillary Clinton. Like these people who like these politicians are within the same camp. They are broadly liberal Democrats, but nothing could be more separating them, right? Like they are very different claims that they represent. Classical liberalism, libertarianism is very different from more neoliberal candidate, for example. And they always have some infighting. So liberal democracy and liberalism itself has what Freud calls the problem of, how does he call it? Narcissism of the small differences. That's how Freud calls it. Once you only have small differences with each other, you always fight over these small differences, right? You forget that you share 95% of common values. You only focus on these 5%. That's like narcissism of small differences. That's why you should never pick, like, here's some good advice on relationships, never pick a partner that is too close to you, because you will get into more fights because they are so similar to you. Anyways, besides this powerful relationship advice, I think it also applies to liberalism. And I came up with a different term. I think it's not only that this narcissism is dangerous, I also think it separates the movements. There's something, what I call the separating power of these small differences or marginal disagreements. Once you share 95%, this debate about the 5% where you don't share a common value gets divisive, that you as a movement split. And I have worked with many different people and many different parties to know that this has occurred many times, that people who were broadly liberal Democrats like separated into many different movements over time. So this was the first problem. Liberal democracy is just a very big tent, and there's like a lot of infighting going on. In fact, I think the last 20 or 30 years was a lot of infighting in the movement. And the second, maybe bigger problem is the following. After the Soviet Union collapsed, this guy, Francis Fukuyama, wrote a very famous essay and then later on a book on the history of, the end of man, so the end of history. And in the end of history, basically he argues, and I bastardize his argument a little bit to make it easier to understand. He basically says that it's just a matter of time until all countries will adopt liberal democratic frameworks. Okay, liberal democracy has won. It's kind of the governing paradigm, and it's just a matter of time. It has only one last bastion, namely the Soviet Union, who has resisted liberal democratic governance, and this will be now overcome. It is now overcome, and it will be rolled out. And if you are a liberal Democrat and you hear stuff like that, of course, you get lazy, because, I mean, it's just a matter of time, Fukuyama says, until all countries will adopt liberal democracy, right? So it's just inevitable. So some sort of complacency, that's like another word for being lazy, kind of governed, I think, the debate. And suddenly we realize that liberal democracy is not the inevitable winner of the best governance structure. In fact, people openly challenge it. Of course, there are very few people who say, oh, trash liberal democracy, and we should all have fascism again. Like, I think nobody really seriously advances such arguments. There are also very few people who say, oh, let's overcome liberal democracy and do socialism again. Like, there are also very few people doing that. But what is more dangerous right now is that people rolling back liberal democracy and saying we are creating illiberal democracy. That's the populists. If you understood now this sentence that Viktor Orban uttered, Viktor Orban says, We are not liberal democrats, we are illiberal democrats. And that's the fundamental backlash against liberal democracy winning. If you have followed in the 90s and 2000s, the democracy indices, they were always claiming we have more and more countries adopting democracy historically over time, you know, and then they made a new chart of how many democracies have been added to the list. I think the last 2 or 3 years, maybe even more, these indices go back. The countries who have classified as liberal democracies were rolled back and left that path of liberal democracy. So it's not like Fukuyama said, it's inevitable that we will all end up with liberal democracy, but there's a fundamental backlash. And I guess it's grounded in the success of liberal democracy. It is the most dominant political paradigm of the 20th and early 21st century. And now it faces its backlash. And this backlash is populism. And once you understand populism as anti-pluralism, you understand that it is a backlash. Liberal democracy, or like pluralism, has been winning, and now you develop the counter movement. And hopefully that all falls now into places and pieces and makes sense why populism is such a relevant force, because it is the backlash to liberal democracy. And if you analyze political landscape from that perspective, a lot of things that we're seeing kind of make sense. If you want to dive more into actually like a lot of the philosophical underpinnings, there's an interesting book by Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed. Deneen is also like a regular speaker at some of these conferences. I think the book is certainly interesting to read. So if you believe that this is kind of true, then you will understand that populism is basically the backlash to the success of liberal democracy. And that's why a lot of these supposedly in the beginning liberal democratic rulers like Putin in the beginning, also like Erdoğan, have abandoned that path and opted for an option that doesn't go down the route of pluralism, but instead offers another route down there. And I will skip all of this a little bit ahead. I hope that all makes kind of sense to you now. You see the great realignment of, I would say, the populism versus the pluralists. The pluralists here are with the young generation, the leading one, but I think as equally interesting as the first bar is the second bar, which is the Green Party, which is, I think, in Germany, the most clear representative of the open society. So once you believe my narrative that it is closed versus open society, you understand that chart now very well. It's the closed versus the open society. And with that, I want to close, and I hope you found it a little bit interesting how I kind of classified populism and modern political landscape. I hope that kind of makes sense to you. Of course, I will send my slides as PowerPoint, like as a PDF to the organizers, so you have access to that. And I think we have like 15 minutes for Q&A, if I am not mistaken. But that seems to be all I have to say. And I would be more than happy to dive into your questions. So I don't know how we want to do it with the moderation.
You can read a chat, and now I can see that Alexander wants to ask something in with a voice. So yeah, please.
Then let's take first like people talking.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I want to ask you a question. At first, thank you for your interesting lecture about populism and its aspects. But at the end, I want to ask you, isn't it just a political stigma? Because all your examples were the politicians with conservative background. But if we will change, you said such aspects of populism, like populism attacks diversity, attacks civil society, attacks rule of law, and multi-party system. But if we will change diversity for unity, we can say that every liberal or left liberal politician is also populist. Also Justin Trudeau, because we remember his scandal with the budget system in Canada. And of course, we can say that Biden also is populist because he supports the people who acts outside the law, and he attacks Republican Party. He attacks the part of people who support conservative ideas. So we can say that populism, this is this is just a political stigma, as for me. My question is, isn't it? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there is, in the media, often the word populism used as a stigma, and it often leads like against what the media thinks is good. Like they use it as a slur, and I disagree with that. And I hope I tried, at least in this lecture, to say that it has a couple of conceptual features. However, you remind me of one thing that I didn't say that I should have said. It doesn't mean that each of these criteria individually make a populist. So for example, if you are like close to the people, like if you do, for example, proximity to the people as a rhetorical device, you're not automatically a populist. In philosophical terms, it means that these criteria that I gave here, the 6 of them, they are necessary, but not sufficient. That means like somebody, like for example, Emmanuel Macron, he could be leader focused because he doesn't really have a party, right? He's more like a movement and he's the leader. But it doesn't make him a populist just because he clicks one box. It is important to say that they are kind of jointly sufficient. So they have to come all together to be qualified as a populist. Again, this is very hard to do in political theory because the field is emerging. So we are coming up with this criterion on the go. If you want to read more about it, Jan Werner Müller's book on populism is excellent on this, although it makes basically the same claims I'm doing. So it's a complex relationship that people have to have with these conditions. It's not perfect. You cannot say, okay, like these are the checklist for the populist, but it helps us to make sense of it. So let me give the example that you use about Joe Biden. Okay, Joe Biden is also moralizing to a certain degree. Joe Biden maybe does even some of the us versus them, although I would say I'm much more skeptical that he does that. But let's take it for the argument that he does. Well, these two things don't necessarily make him a populist because he's not an anti-pluralist. People like Joe Biden don't want to roll back the rule of law. They don't want to attack individual rights. And that's what you see with the populists that they are doing. For example, let's take Poland. Poland famously rolled back a lot of civil society. Like they changed the funding structure of civil society to deny heterogeneity in the society, diversity in civil society. They funded basically things that they perceived themselves as valuable. So they are fundamentally anti-pluralist, and that's why I stress it so much. I think Joe Biden is not an anti-pluralist. Emmanuel Macron is not an anti-pluralist. They have some populist features from this list, but that doesn't make them a populist in a meaningful sense. However, left-wing populists are often anti-pluralists, like Maduro in Venezuela, right? Or, as I said, the proto-populist of Lukashenko, obviously, is also economically very hardcore left-wing. Marine Le Pen is to a certain degree left-wing. So these are anti-pluralists in the way they operate. They roll back institutions and they deny heterogeneity in society. And I don't think people like Emmanuel Macron or Joe Biden do that. So that's why I would say that's how we have to work with this framework of the 6 criteria that I put out there. It's not like one qualifies and you're a populist, but you have to look at the interplay that goes in there. Good, I hope that answered the question. I have some more.
Okay, thank you.
Is it okay, Alexander? Does it answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. That's all. Cool. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, and then after was Maria, and also the question from her about name of the book.
Yeah, I type it down.
Yeah, and Maria, if you have extra question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sven, a lot for the lecture. It really was cool. But I have a question about what do you think populism has to do with the new media? Because I've heard a lot that it's kind of populism really use new media for its, I don't know, popularity. New media really helps it. But I feel like that internet new media space is really pluralistic. So like what it has to do with that? Oh, yeah.
I saw. Because I wanted to share my screen. Yeah, as you see, I don't have necessarily so much on communication out there because I think a lot is not really yet well understood how the propaganda works and how social media is used. I think one interesting tool that populists use online is the silent majority, right? because by generating bots and by generating like some sort of public appearance that you have support, you can create the image of like, okay, more people are behind me. And second, you can divide people. And that's, I think, especially, unfortunately, Russia is very good at that, like to make very divisive politics out of the online space, right? I suffered that from that myself. I gave a lot of interviews on the topic of Belarus, and I got targeted by Russia Today the other day. Like some of my posts are like by these bot farms, you know, like attacked. And they are like dividing people up, or either like criticizing me in a sense, like giving me the silent majorities against me, the ordinary man would speak up against with their fake profiles. So I think they use these two devices a lot. Divide, this is crucial. I think I recently listened to a good podcast. Maybe I come up with the name, but if not, you can drop me an email later and I will search for it. For example, there was from the Russian side, they tried to bring this racial divisiveness to steer this in the US from outside, you know, like by making videos produced with Black people from Africa, produced in Russia, and then broadcasted into the US to divide around these controversial lines society. So they understand that if politics becomes us versus them, they are the best at that. Like they are very good at us versus them. Trump is the best at, like, I almost speak like Trump when I imitate him. Like it's very good at us versus them. No, like picking out the globalists, Steve Bannon always says, versus the others. So this is good. That's a tool they use a lot online. And then second is like this impression of vast support. Like some posts that they put out there, a lot of people and fake profiles comment on it, gives you a sense of majority. But again, doesn't necessarily have to be true, you know. There's much more to say about propaganda and how it works online. But this, I think my best guess is that these rhetorical devices of us versus them and the silent majority is something that they use in their propaganda. But there's much more to say, obviously.
Well, let's take the next question from the chat. Mikhail wrote, what are reasons of the populist movements? Can you find it? What are reasons of the populist movements rise and growing popularity in Europe, particularly among population recently? Do they have major perspectives? And if yes, does it poses a threat for the stability of Europe?
Yeah, I think so. Why does, like, some people tend to ask me, why does populism arrive mostly in like Western countries? This is a Western phenomenon. Well, I don't think so. We see it anyways a lot in other countries. Latin America is like the continent where you have observed it the most. Like Gaudilloism, like the strongman leader, this kind of populism has been around for a long time there. However, I think we observe it in the West the best because we start from a different starting point, namely liberal democracy. So the West has always been the showcase of liberal democracy. And I think populism is the rollback of liberal democracy, right? That's what, for example, makes Putin and Lukashenko not populists. They are autocrats. They transferred not liberal democracies into the autocratic systems that we have there now, but qualify for a lot of the features that populists have. But the starting point is different. For populists, I think the starting point is crucial, that they kind of roll back liberal democracy. And I think if you wanted to look at 2 case studies where this is done by the playbook, almost like by academic rigor, it is Hungary and Poland. The way they attack the rule of law and pluralistic civil society and then individual rights, like recently with the debate about women's rights in Poland, is like by the playbook. It just goes one step by one step. Viktor Orban does the same. He in order to preserve his power, he wiggled with the election law so that his party, Fidesz, although they only get like 50% of the votes, they get 68% of the representation or something, you know, just by the way that the election law is designed. So wiggling with all these sorts of, or like even better example from Hungary, no, it's Poland, or both in fact, is the constitutional courts. Like if you look at how they do the courts, they struggled in Poland with the Supreme Court. So what did they do? They passed a new retirement age for judges, and then therefore used this retirement age to replace them by their own appointees after changing the appointment structure. Again, always look, when you look for populists, how do they, in their rhetorics, attack diversity in society, because they deny pluralism. They always make the narrative, Russian people are like this, Turkish people are like this, blah, blah, blah. And the second is, how do they attack pluralistic institutions, especially the rule of law and civil society? That's where they immediately go after. Again, this is a playbook that they learned kind of from the autocrats. And you will see that again with Putin, Lukashenko. Lukashenko basically did the same in the early 90s.
Well, the next
oh yeah, and of course Georgia is also a good case.
Yeah. Yes. The next question is with the raised hand by Gabriela. Gabriela, can you switch on your? Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to ask you about like the Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia at the end of when the communist bloc collapsed. Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, they were like the leaders of the new democratic countries. And, you know, the solidarity in Poland and all the civic movements in those countries. So what happened in those societies that led to populist leaders?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think you cannot just say like it's in all countries the same. So the origins of these populist movements might be very different for people like Viktor Orban than it is for Kaczynski or whatever in Poland, right? But I think Poland is very interesting because Poland is an outlier in one sense that people often assume, this populist movement came about because of the EU or something like that. But if you see in the polling, Poland is, as you highlight, like one of the countries that is actually a good showcase, like high approval rates of Europe. Like I think the highest in whole Europe for approval rates of the EU. So it's not like the classical case that people know from, for example, Brexit or other movements that they are against the elites in that sense. I think what caused it in Poland was their real appeal to a common narrative. So and then the playbook that they played afterwards. So I think through culturally very clear how do you say, conservative positions, they gained a voting basis and then started to step by step dismantle, and the institutions made them so powerful as it is today. So for example, the change in the election system in Poland, for example, and the way that judges are appointed is a fundamental departure. Like you cannot fight peace or like Law and Justice Party on all terms anymore. So for example, if you want to win an election district against peace, you have to win a winner takes it all election. And therefore, an opposition has to kind of unite and merge and therefore lose their own identity in order to compete with them, right? And so they kind of eradicated the liberal democratic system over time. The exact reasons, it's very hard to say, as I said, because now we are so far deep down that it's very hard to compete. The original reasons, I think, was the appeal of certain popular leaders that use the right rhetorical devices, as well as sometimes mundane economic reasons. Although I don't see that in Poland, to be honest. You know, in Poland, again, it's not a case where you can say people voted for economic reasons, Kaczynski and peace into government, because they were like the success story of the EU in terms of economic growth. So again, sometimes it's just as banal as like basic politics, good leader, charismatic agenda, and like something that resonated with people. Maybe like after somebody like Donald Tusk, you were fed up with technocracy, you know, and wanted something that has more conservative Catholic values. But again, each country demands its own analysis. That's all I want to say. You cannot say, oh, economic problems caused populism. The main thing is that identity politics and matters of such moral dimension entered politics again. In Poland, I think it is the identity is Catholicism and like conservative values. In the US, it is like also almost a blue collar movement. So stuff like this. I think when identity comes into politics, populism flourishes, and that kind of explains a little bit, hopefully, what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah, you can just switch on your voice and ask. Yeah, seems not. So Okay.
Yeah,
Well, thank you very much, and I'll send you all chat and video because I was recording it for the future, and if you want to write yes, thanks.
Yeah, you can feel free to contact me by email, like some of you have already done so in the past. That was great. You can also add me on my social media channels and like just ask me questions. Like I also happy to share reading lists, because in 1 hour I cannot tell everything that I have to say about this. And I think especially Gabriela's question was like, I could say 2 hours about this, because I think it's an excellent question. Please be in touch with me in that regard. I'm very happy to do so and to facilitate. So yeah, thanks a lot to all of you. Excellent stuff.